Imagine a world where the living communed with the dead, where desperate pleas and forbidden rituals echoed through the silent darkness. What if the ancient Roman catacombs were more than just tombs, but clandestine stages for chilling, unspeakable rites? We're diving deep into the suffocating depths to reveal what really happened in these eerie subterranean labyrinths. I'm talking about narrow tunnels carved into volcanic rock, stretching for hundreds of miles beneath the streets of Rome, places where thousands gathered in secret, where the walls whisper stories of defiance, desperation, and devotion. Today, we're separating fact from fiction, uncovering the shocking truth about what actually occurred in these underground cities of the dead. So if you're ready to descend into one of history's most misunderstood mysteries, hit that subscribe button and let's begin our journey into the dark. Let me ask you something. What is it about underground spaces that captures our imagination? Why do catacombs, crypts, and subterranean chambers feature so prominently in our horror stories, our nightmares, our fascination with the macabre? The Roman catacombs have this almost magnetic pull on our collective consciousness. They're portrayed in movies as sites of demonic rituals, vampire lairs, and cult gatherings. Hollywood has made a fortune convincing us that unspeakable things happened in those tunnels. But here's the thing that'll surprise you. The truth is somehow both less sensational and more fascinating than the fiction. These weren't just spooky tunnels where ancient Romans played around with dark magic. They were something far more complex, far more human, and in many ways far more interesting. First, let's establish what the catacombs actually were. Starting around the 2nd century CE, Romans began excavating these underground burial chambers outside the city walls. Why outside? Because Roman law strictly prohibited burials within the sacred city boundaries. The living and the dead had to remain separate. But here's where it gets interesting. While Romans traditionally practiced cremation, certain groups, particularly early Christians and Jews, preferred burial. They believed in bodily resurrection, which meant they needed to preserve the body. The catacombs became the answer to this problem. Now imagine this. Over 40 catacombs exist beneath Rome alone, containing an estimated 6 million burials. 6 million. That's not a cemetery, that's an entire underground metropolis of the dead. The catacombs of Calixtus alone stretch over 12 miles of tunnels stacked in multiple levels, descending 65 feet below the surface. The volcanic tuff rock around Rome was perfect for excavation, soft enough to carve, but sturdy enough not to collapse. Workers called fossers, literally diggers, carved these labyrinthine passages by torchlight, creating burial niches called loculi, stacked floor to ceiling like ancient filing cabinets for the dead. But burial was just the beginning. These spaces became something Rome's authorities never anticipated, gathering places, worship centers, and yes, sites of rituals that would have been absolutely forbidden above ground. Over the next 15 minutes, we're going to explore the real activities that took place in these tunnels. We'll examine the desperate faith of persecuted Christians holding secret masses among the dead. We'll uncover evidence of pagan practices that refused to die. We'll investigate claims of blood sacrifices and forbidden rites. And we'll use cutting-edge archaeology to separate documented fact from centuries of legend and fear-mongering. Because the truth about what happened in the Roman catacombs is a story about human survival, defiance, and the lengths people will go to preserve their beliefs when the entire weight of an empire demands they abandon them. Let's descend into the darkness and find out what's really down there. Picture Rome in the 3rd century. If you're a Christian, your religion is illegal. Depending on which emperor is in power, you could face anything from social persecution to outright execution. The famous Roman persecutions weren't constant, but they were brutal when they occurred. Under emperors like Decius Valerian and most famously Diocletian, Christians were hunted, their property confiscated, their churches destroyed. So where do you go when you can't worship openly? Where do you gather when your faith could get you killed? You go underground. Now, here's where we need to separate myth from reality. Popular imagination suggests Christians spent years hiding in the catacombs, conducting services by flickering candlelight, always one step ahead of Roman soldiers. The truth is more nuanced. While Christians definitely used the catacombs for worship, especially during intense persecution periods, they weren't living down there full time like some underground resistance movement. Archaeological evidence shows that Christians held regular commemorative meals, called Refrigerium, at the tombs of martyrs. These weren't quiet, somber affairs. We're talking about gatherings where communities ate, drank wine, sang hymns, and celebrated the memories of those who died for their faith. The graffiti scratched into catacomb walls tells us this clearly. Messages like Peter and Paul, "Pray for Victor," or "Refresh the souls of your loved ones." The catacombs also hosted the Agape Feast, a communal meal that early Christians practiced as a form of religious fellowship. During persecution, these gatherings took on additional significance. They weren't just eating together. They were defying an empire that wanted to erase their very existence. One of the most powerful pieces of evidence for Christian worship in the catacombs is the Fractiopanis fresco in the Catacomb of Priscilla, dating to the late 2nd century. It depicts 7 figures around a table with bread and fish, clearly representing the Eucharist. This isn't just art. It's proof that sacred rituals, the very heart of Christian practice, were being performed in these underground chambers. But Christians weren't the only ones using the catacombs. This is where things get really interesting, because the religious landscape of ancient Rome was far more complex than Christianity versus paganism. It was a swirling mix of beliefs, and the catacombs reflect this beautifully. Recent excavations have revealed pagan symbols mixed with Christian imagery. In some chambers you'll find a Christian Chi-Rho symbol on one wall and pagan motifs on another. Why? Because these spaces were being used by multiple communities, and because religious syncretism was incredibly common. People were hedging their spiritual bets, combining elements from different traditions. The cult of the dead was huge in Roman culture. Romans believed that proper veneration of ancestors was essential for both the living and the dead. They left offerings at tombs, poured libations, held elaborate memorial meals. When people converted to Christianity, many didn't completely abandon these practices. They adapted them. You can see this fusion in the catacomb of Via Latina, where pagan mythology scenes appear alongside biblical narratives. Hercules and the Old Testament existing side by side, because to these ancient people they weren't necessarily contradictory. They were all part of the same effort to understand death, honor the deceased, and ensure safe passage to whatever came next. This brings us to one of the most fascinating aspects of catacomb archaeology, the hidden language carved into the walls. Early Christians developed an elaborate system of symbols precisely because they needed to communicate their faith without attracting unwanted attention. The fish, or ichthys, became the most famous Christian symbol. Why a fish? Because in Greek, fish is ichthys, which forms an acrostic: Isis Christos Theou Ios Soter, Jesus Christ, God's Son, Savior. But the symbolism goes deeper. The anchor represented hope and steadfastness. The dove symbolized the Holy Spirit and peace. The phoenix, borrowed from pagan mythology, represented resurrection. These weren't just decorative choices. They were a coded language that allowed Christians to identify each other and express their beliefs while maintaining plausible deniability if questioned by authorities. Some of the most intriguing symbols are the ones we still don't fully understand. Mysterious marks, geometric patterns, and abbreviations that have puzzled archaeologists for generations. Were they markers for specific families, directions through the labyrinth, or something more esoteric? The inscriptions tell stories that break your heart. Simple epitaphs like Florentius made this for his well-deserving son, who lived 7 years, 10 months, 20 days, or more desperate pleas: "May you live in God, and in peace with the saints." These weren't forbidden rituals in the satanic sense Hollywood loves. They were forbidden because the Roman state had declared them illegal. The real scandal, the real transgression, was simply believing something different and refusing to give it up even under threat of death. All right, let's address the elephant in the room, or rather the blood on the altar. Were there actual forbidden rituals in the catacombs? Human sacrifices? Blood magic? Dark ceremonies that would justify all those horror movie depictions? The short answer is, almost certainly not in the way you're imagining. But the longer answer is more complex and, frankly, more interesting. Let's start with what we know for certain. Early Christian martyrs were venerated intensely. The tombs of martyrs became pilgrimage sites, and the soil around their graves was considered sacred. People believed that martyrs' blood literally sanctified the ground, making it holy. This isn't metaphorical. They genuinely believed the physical blood had spiritual power. Now, did this lead to unusual practices? Absolutely. There are documented accounts of Christians collecting the blood of martyrs on cloths or sponges during executions, then bringing these relics into the catacombs for veneration. To outsiders, especially to Roman authorities, this looked deeply disturbing. Imagine the propaganda value. These Christians are obsessed with blood. They collect it, they worship it, they hold secret ceremonies around it. But from the Christian perspective, they were honoring heroes of the faith, not conducting dark magic. The archaeological evidence tells us something fascinating about sacrifice in the catacombs, though. Animal bones have been found near certain altars and gathering spaces. These weren't from Christian practices, but likely from the pagan-influenced Refrigerium meals or from Jewish communities who also used the catacombs. Animal sacrifice was completely normal in Roman religious practice. What really gets sensationalized in historical accounts are claims about blood rituals. Roman critics of Christianity, like Celsus and later critics during various persecutions, accused Christians of all sorts of abominations. Drinking blood, they were misunderstanding the Eucharist. Ritual cannibalism, again, misunderstanding communion, even infanticide during secret meetings. These accusations were propaganda, but they stuck. And centuries later, when people explored the catacombs and found strange symbols, darkened chambers, and yes, stains on stone altars, imaginations ran wild. Modern analysis of those stains, usually wine, sometimes blood, but from the animals I mentioned. The forbidden aspect wasn't the nature of the rituals themselves, it was that they were happening at all, in defiance of imperial decree. Here's where things get genuinely eerie, though. The Roman relationship with death and the dead was fundamentally different from ours. They didn't see the same hard boundary between the living and the dead that we do. The cult of the dead wasn't a spoopy underground religion. It was mainstream Roman practice. They believed the dead needed care, feeding, and attention from the living. The Parentalia festival involved families literally picnicking at gravesites, leaving food and drink for their deceased relatives. They believed the dead could become angry and dangerous if neglected. In the catacombs, this practice intensified because Christians added a layer of martyrdom and miracle working to it. They didn't just remember the dead. They prayed to them, asked for their intercession, believed they could perform miracles from beyond the grave. Archaeologists have found feeding tubes, called tubuli, installed in some grave slabs. These allowed the living to pour libations directly onto the body or into the tomb. They've found entire chamber floors with drainage systems designed to handle the wine and oil being poured out during memorial ceremonies. The practice that probably comes closest to genuinely forbidden territory was necromancy or divination involving the dead. While not widespread, there's evidence that some people attempted to communicate with or receive prophecies from the dead. Roman law actually had provisions against raising shades or disturbing the dead for prophecy. If this happened in the catacombs, it would have been genuinely illegal, even by pagan Roman standards. The catacombs also served as sites for initiation and transformation. Christian baptisms sometimes occurred in catacomb chambers, especially during persecution when above-ground churches were destroyed. Being baptized among the martyrs carried special significance, symbolically dying to your old life and rising to new life in Christ, all while surrounded by those who had literally died for their faith. There's also evidence that the catacombs became meeting places for political dissidents hiding behind religious cover. When you're already breaking the law by being Christian, it's a convenient place to discuss other forms of resistance to imperial authority. Some historians argue that certain revolutionary movements against specific emperors used catacomb gatherings as cover. The initiation into Christian mystery cults, the disciplina arcani or discipline of the secret, meant that certain teachings were only revealed to the fully initiated. Catechism, the teaching of Christian doctrine, often happened in stages, with new converts learning deeper mysteries only after proving their commitment. The catacombs, with their maze-like passages and private chambers, were perfect for this graduated revelation of sacred knowledge. To outsiders, this looked exactly like a mystery cult, no different from the cult of Mithras or the Eleusinian mysteries. Secret knowledge, hidden chambers, initiation rites. The fact that it was happening underground only added to the sense of forbidden knowledge being transmitted. Now, let's talk about how modern science is revolutionizing our understanding of what really happened in these tunnels. For centuries, exploring the catacombs was dangerous, limited, and frankly destructive. Early archaeologists and tomb raiders did significant damage, and many passages were lost or deliberately sealed. But in the last 2 decades, technology has given us unprecedented access to these spaces without disturbing them. LIDAR scanning, which uses laser pulses to create precise 3D maps, has been used in several major catacomb complexes. This technology has revealed entire sections of tunnels that were unknown, sealed off by collapse or deliberately hidden. In 2017, a LIDAR survey of the catacombs of Priscilla revealed a previously unknown chamber containing rare frescoes depicting female clergy, reigniting debates about women's roles in early Christianity. Ground-penetrating radar has located burial chambers without excavation. Genetic analysis of remains is revealing the geographic origins of people buried in the catacombs, showing that Rome's early Christian communities were far more ethnically diverse than previously understood. These weren't just Romans. They were immigrants from across the empire, from North Africa, the Eastern Mediterranean, and beyond. Chemical analysis of residues on altars and in vessels has confirmed what was actually being used in rituals. Those stains everyone speculated about for centuries, we can now test them. The results show wine, olive oil, and plant resins used as incense. Exactly what you'd expect from documented Christian and pagan practices. Perhaps most exciting are the advances in epigraphy, the study of inscriptions. New imaging techniques using different light wavelengths can reveal text that's been worn away or deliberately scratched out. We're reading messages and names that haven't been visible for 1,700 years, and what they're telling us is rewriting parts of early Christian history. Debunking the myths, so let's systematically demolish some of the most persistent myths about the catacombs. Myth 1. Christians lived in the catacombs to escape persecution. Reality. No. The catacombs were burial places that were occasionally used for worship and gatherings. They were well known to Roman authorities, and living in them long-term would have been impractical and deeply unpleasant. They were cold, damp, dark, and filled with decomposing bodies. Myth 2. The catacombs were secret labyrinths where Christians hid from soldiers. Reality. The catacombs were legal burial grounds. Roman law protected burial sites as sacred. Authorities knew exactly where they were. What made them useful during persecutions wasn't that they were hidden, but that religious law made it complicated for soldiers to enter and desecrate burial spaces. Myth 3. Human sacrifices and satanic rituals occurred in the catacombs. Reality. There's zero archaeological evidence for this. None. The blood rituals were veneration of martyrs' relics and the symbolic drinking of wine as Christ's blood during communion. Both practices that might seem bizarre to outsiders but weren't forbidden by Roman law because of their content, only because Christianity itself was illegal. Myth 4. The symbols and codes were mystical magic. Reality. They were practical and theological. They identified Christian spaces, conveyed biblical messages through art, and helped people navigate the complex tunnel systems. The mystery in them is religious, not occult. Myth 5. The catacombs are full of ancient curses and supernatural danger. Reality. This is pure Hollywood. The dangers of the catacombs are mundane. Collapse, getting lost, oxygen depletion in poorly ventilated sections, and pathogens from ancient remains. The curse of the pharaohs was more interesting, and that was debunked decades ago. The human element. But here's what makes all of this truly compelling. Behind every symbol, every inscription, every carefully carved burial niche is a human story. There's the tomb of Cecilia, who died at age 22, her parents' inscription reading, "To our sweetest daughter, who in life was the light of our eyes." There's the graffiti from a grieving husband. "I know not how to weep for you, dear wife, except to say that you deserved a better fate than this." There are children's tombs decorated with toys and dolls carved into the stone. There are mass burial sites from plague years, where families dumped dozens of bodies in desperate haste, barely able to honor their dead properly. The forbidden rituals we've been investigating were ultimately expressions of hope against desperation. These were people living under an empire that demanded religious conformity, facing persecution, disease, economic hardship, and the universal human fear of death and what comes after. When they gathered in those tunnels to celebrate communion, they weren't doing it because it was thrilling or transgressive. They were doing it because their faith was the only thing that made sense of a chaotic, often brutal world. When they carved symbols into the walls, they were leaving messages for fellow believers. We were here. We believed. We endured. The real story of the catacombs isn't about Forbidden's dark magic or ancient conspiracies. It's about human resilience, about people finding ways to maintain their identity and beliefs even when the most powerful empire in the world told them they couldn't. So, what's left of these underground worlds today? Can you visit them? What's still being discovered? Several of Rome's major catacombs are open to the public. The catacombs of San Callisto, San Sebastiano, Domitilla, and Priscilla welcome thousands of tourists every year. But here's the thing. You're only seeing a tiny fraction. Most passages remain closed to the public, either because they're too dangerous, too fragile, or still under active archaeological investigation. The Vatican maintains strict control over several Christian catacombs, and the Pontifical Commission for Sacred Archaeology oversees excavations and preservation. They're understandably protective. These sites are both invaluable historical resources and sacred spaces for millions of believers. What's particularly exciting is that new discoveries are still happening regularly. In 2021, archaeologists found an entirely new catacomb complex beneath a parking lot in Rome. Initial surveys suggest it contains at least 2 miles of tunnels that no one has explored in over a millennium. Climate change and urban development pose serious threats to the catacombs. Water infiltration is increasing, and the vibrations from modern traffic above are causing structural damage. Some passages that were stable for 2,000 years are now at risk of collapse. Preserving these sites for future generations is an ongoing challenge. Why do the catacombs continue to fascinate us? Why, in 2024, are we still making videos about what happened in Roman tunnels 2,000 years ago? I think it's because they represent something profound about the human experience. They're physical evidence of the lengths people will go to preserve what they believe in. They're a reminder that faith, community, and identity are worth dying for to some people. They also represent mystery in the best sense. Not everything has been discovered. Not every inscription has been translated. Not every chamber has been mapped. There are still secrets down there, still stories waiting to be uncovered. In an age where we can Google almost anything, where satellite imagery shows us every corner of the earth, the idea that there are still unknown spaces literally beneath our feet is thrilling. The catacombs force us to confront our relationship with death. Modern Western culture tends to hide death, sanitize it, keep it at arm's length. The Romans integrated death into life in ways we find uncomfortable. They ate meals at grave sites. They talked to their dead relatives. They weren't afraid to acknowledge that death was always present. Maybe that's the real forbidden aspect of the catacombs. Not that dark rituals happen there, but that they force us to confront a truth we prefer to avoid. Death is universal, inevitable, and throughout history, humans have created elaborate systems to make sense of it and maintain connections beyond it. So here's my challenge to you. Look deeper into history. Question the sensational narratives you've been fed by pop culture. When you hear about forbidden rituals or ancient mysteries, ask yourself, what's the evidence? What were the actual people involved thinking and feeling? The story of the Roman catacombs is ultimately a story about ordinary people dealing with extraordinary circumstances. They weren't performing black magic or worshiping demons. They were burying their dead with dignity, holding on to their beliefs despite persecution, and trying to maintain community in a hostile world. That's a story that resonates across centuries because humans haven't fundamentally changed. We still seek meaning, we still build communities around shared beliefs, and we still find ways to resist when authorities tell us what we're allowed to think or believe. If you found this fascinating, there's so much more to explore. Look into the Jewish catacombs of Rome, which predate the Christian ones. Research the mystery cults of the Roman Empire. Investigate how archaeology is uncovering new insights into early Christianity every year. And if you ever get the chance to visit Rome, book a catacomb tour. Walk those tunnels. Feel the weight of thousands of years of history. Stand in the chambers where people gathered in secret, whispered prayers in the darkness, and defied an empire. Because the real forbidden ritual, the real transgressive act, was simply insisting on the right to believe differently. And that's a story that matters just as much today as it did 2,000 years ago. Thanks for joining me on this journey into the depths. If you enjoyed this deep dive into what really happened in the Roman catacombs, hit that like button and subscribe for more explorations of history's mysteries. Drop a comment below. What other ancient sites do you want me to investigate? What secrets are still buried, waiting to be uncovered? Until next time, keep questioning, keep exploring, and remember, the truth is always more interesting than the legend.